Nonetheless, dear Muslim, with the finishing of the Gregorian calendar and starting of the new year, we think about what we have accomplished in the previous year and what we did not accomplish again. There's no spiritual importance whether it is 24 or 25. Anything causes to reflect about our time that is indeed beneficial. Um, and one of the myths we need to dispel completely is that we don't have time. By Allah, I have time, you have time, and every single person has time. But the thing is, how do we spend our time? How do we what do we prioritize, and how do we spend our time? So I just want to give three advices to myself from the Quran and Sunnah. This topic is the beauty of the Quran. So I want to give myself three advices from the Quran regarding the importance of time. Um, and three tips that will benefit all of us to spend our time more wisely. First of all, one of the traps of shaitan is that whenever we are worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're spending too much time. Even those that are regularly praying 5 times, when they stand up for salah, like every time we stand up for salah, shaitan comes and tells us that you're spending too much time. You should finish your salah and do something else. You should stop your salah and you have a meeting coming up. Just go join your meeting. But we forget that the most important thing we can do in this life is to invest our time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And invest our time for Allah and for the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how can we invest? Why should we invest our time for the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ وَشِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and we send down from the Quran that which is a cure and mercy for the believers. This Quran is a mercy and cure for the hearts. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also mentioned in a beautiful verse, He said, شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس. The month of Ramadan in which the Quran was revealed as a guidance for mankind. And we know of the virtue of the Quran. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, يقال لصاحب القرآن اقرأ وارتق ورتل كما كنت ترتل في الدنيا فإن منزلك عند آخر آية تقرأها. Our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that on the day of judgment, the one who was devoted to the Quran will be told on the day of judgment, recite the Quran and ascend in ranks, as you used to recite when you were in the world. Your rank will be at the last verse you recite. Your rank will be the last verse you recite. And another narration, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, وَمَا اجْتَمَعَ قَوْمٌ فِي بَيْتٍ مِّن بُيُوتِ اللَّهِ يَتْلُونَ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ وَيَتَدَارَسُونَهُ بَيْنَهُمْ إِلَّا نَزَلَتْ عَلَيْهِمُ السَّكِينَةُ وَغَشِيَتْهُمُ الرَّحْمَةُ وَحَفَّتْهُمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَذَكَرَهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي مَنْ عِندَهُ. When people gather in one of Allah's house to recite His book, learning and teaching it, tranquility descends upon them, mercy engulfs them, angels surround them, and Allah mentions them to the angels in His proximity. And the Prophet ﷺ, and many other narration, the Prophet ﷺ talked about the importance of reciting the Quran, importance of connecting to the Quran. One time the Prophet ﷺ, he sent a army, and then in this army, this group of army, they went to a Sariya. And then in Salah, there was a one companion, he used to recite every single Salah, he used to recite Surah Al-Ikhlas, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Every single Salah, he used to recite this surah. So when they returned, they complained to the Prophet ﷺ. They said, the Prophet of Allah, sorry about that, the Prophet of Allah ﷺ, that what is the reason that this person, this Amir of this Jama'ah, this he always recite this surah, Surah Al-Ikhlas. Every single salah, he recite this surah. They complained to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Saluhu li'ayyi shay'in yasna'u dhalik." Go and ask this person what is the reason that he's doing this. And they went and they asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that and they asked this person, the person who is to recite Surah Al-Ikhlas in every single salah. And he replied, because لأنها صفة الرحمن, because it talks about the attributes of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I love to recite about the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said, لأن حبها أدخله الجنة. His love for this surah, this small surah from the Quran, has entered him into paradise. And another narration, our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that because of his love for this small verse of the Quran, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves this person. So just imagine this person connected with the Quran just through a small surah of the Quran. He just knew a small surah of the Quran. And because of that, it is a reason for him to enter into paradise. Just imagine if you memorize the whole Quran, if you always reciting the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the number one tips that I can give to myself and all of the audience here is that invest your time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Never think that if I spend some time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that if I spending too much time doing the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or praying salah, or praying nafil salah, sunnah salah, that I'm wasting my time. No, never think that. This is one of the biggest trap of shaitan. Shaitan wants to distract us. Every time we stand for salah, shaitan comes and tells us, quickly finish your salah and leave the masjid and do your thing. You have a job, you have a meeting, you have to go for shopping, but we must remember that we shouldn't be stingy with our time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We look at the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he achieved like none other. He achieved so much in last 10 years of his life, in 23 years, that we cannot achieve in our entire life. 67 years we cannot achieve. We look at some of the scholars like Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, one of the greatest scholar of Islam. He relatively lived for 50 years, but just imagine how many books he wrote. He wrote a book between Salatul Dhuhr and Salatul Asr, and in Medina, the students, they spend the whole year studying that book. Just imagine, he wrote that book in 1 hour. The students in Medina, they spend 1 year reciting and reading that book to the mashayikh. And we see Imam al-Nawawi, the person who wrote Riyadh al-Salihin, he lived for a few decades, but just imagine how much he achieved. Until now we recite their books. Look at Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah. So how did they benefit their time? It is not about how much time we have, but how do we benefit from our time? How do we utilize our time? Time has barakah and function and utility. Time, everyone has the same time, but how we use that time. We need barakah in that time. So number one tip to get barakah in our time is to spend time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To spend time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we should never be stingy with our time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Look at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He had the greatest task in this world. He was the greatest leader, and he had the greatest task of taking care of the humanity. But even then, he used to pray Salat al-Tahajjud every single night. So just imagine, me and you, we should spend our time, praying at night. We should never think that if I pray at night, I'm gonna miss my job, I'm gonna miss my classes. No, by praying 2 rak'ah at night, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give barakah in our time. And number two is that we should sleep early and wake up early. And our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would love to sleep early and he would love to wake up early. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Burika li ummati fi bukuriha," that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed my ummah in their mornings. So we start early. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after Salatul Fajr, he would speak to the companions, and every time he would send for a transaction, he would send them in the morning. So start early your day. The new year coming, make sure you start early. Start your day with the recitation of the Quran, with the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with muhasabah. And number three is that actively try to avoid lahu and la'i. Actively try to avoid lahu and la'ib. In this world, there are many lahu and la'ib. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا لَهُ وَلَعِبٌ. This world is just the amusement and play. The people want to amuse themselves. Today we see the people spending hours and hours watching TV, watching news, watching movies, and all kind of other apps and all kind of distractions, right? Our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is mentioned average American, they spend 5.5 hours just scrolling through social media. 5.5 hours, just imagine. Average American. So there are some people who spend more than that. Some people spend 8 hours, 9 hours just watching TV, watching lahu and live, and some people do less. So it is very important that we know the importance of time. Didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us in the Quran about the importance of time, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, أَوَلَمْ نُعَمِّرْكُمْ مَا يَتَذَكَّرُ فِيهِ مَنْ تَذَكَّرَ وَجَاءَكُمُ النَّذِيرُ فَذُوقُوا فَمَا لِلظَّالِمِينَ مِنْ نَظِيرٍ. فَذُوقُوا فَمَا لِلظَّالِمِينَ مِنْ نَصِيرٍ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, on the day of judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tell the people, أَوَلَمْ نُعَمِّرْكُمْ مَا يَتَذَكَّرُ فِيهِ مَنْ تَذَكَّرَ, that didn't we give you the life to live, to benefit? Why didn't you benefit? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us another ayah. He said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, on the day of judgment, Allah will ask the people, how long did you live in this earth? كم لبثتم في الأرض عدد السنين؟ قالوا لبثنا يوما أو بعض يوم. People will say, I lived for a day or a part of a day, maybe an hour. And some places Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that sa'a, they will say, oh Allah, I lived only for an hour. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us in the Quran that يَوْمَ يَرَوْنَهَا لَمْ يَلْبَثُوا إِلَّا عَشِيَّةً أَوْ ضُحَاهَا. On the day of judgment, the people will regret and they will say, oh Allah, we only lived for morning or evening. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also reminds us that on the day of judgment, people will say that, oh Allah, send us back to this world. Send us back to this world so we can spend our youth worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reciting your book and pleasing you. Allah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he encourages the youth to spend time wisely. And on the day of judgment, 5 questions will be asked to every single person. And 2 of them will be about an shababihi. Where did you spend your youth and where did you spend your life? So this life and this time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, it is an amana from Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to ask us about each moment, how we spend this life. So my dear young brothers and sisters, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentioned in a famous narration, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, 7 types of people Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them shade under the arsh of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of resurrection. And one type, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, شاب نشأ في عبادة الله. That young person who grows up worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam also mentioned in a beautiful narration, he said that نعمتان مغبون فيهما كثير من الناس الصحة والفراغ. The 2 of the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, many people are losing out. One is good health and one is free time. The health that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. As soon as we become sick, we will know the value of this health. And the free time that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. My dear young brothers and sisters, my dear Muslims, please take benefit from your time. Do not waste your time in lahu and la'i. So to summarize, to conclude, just the three tips that we talked about is the first is that we should invest our time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So invest our money, invest our energy for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the second one is that we should start early. We should sleep early and start early. We should go to sleep at night, early. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rebuked the people who stays awake and talks about useless things. So we should sleep early and wake up early. And the third advice is that we should actively try to avoid lahu and la'i. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the ability to practice upon these three tips, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept this effort, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan, Shaykh.